Right now, they're raising rate. They're telling us the economy is doing well. They're talking about unwinding their balance sheet. And my question to you is, what's changed in the economy that they decided to do this now?
Well, it may just be talk. They've been talking about raising interest rates for 7 years? And they've raised them a minuscule amount. In fact, I would say they haven't raised them at all because the growth of inflation has been far higher than the increase in interest rates. So the real rates have actually fallen. So when they talk about they're raising a nominal interest rate by 25 basis points, they're not talking about anything because the inflation has more than canceled it out. My sometime co-author, Dave Kranzler, the other day posted an analysis, and what he shows is that, in fact, interest rates are falling. The long rates are falling, the 10-year rate, such that the gap between the Fed overnight rate, which is the one they claim they raised, and the 10-year rate is narrowing. And so the real cost of borrowing for people, particularly people dealing with the derivative type things, is falling. And you can see the long rate has fallen consistently. So it doesn't mean anything for those reasons. First of all, again, the 25 basis point increase, I think they've done twice or something, is far lower than the rise in inflation. And so it's not a rise. The real rates continue to fall.
Do you think that the economy has improved enough for them to start doing this? Has anything really changed in the economy?
Well, there's no improvement in the economy except the fake news. They make it look like an improvement. For example, they say the unemployment rate is 4.7% or something like that. And they can get that figure because they don't count the discouraged workers. So if you haven't looked for a job in the last 4 weeks, when they do these surveys, you're not considered to be in the workforce. And so you may have been unemployed for 3 or 4 years or 5 or 6 years. You're not counted. You're not part of the unemployed. It's only people who are looking in the last 4 weeks for a job. Now, what tends to happen to people who are unemployed, if you go searching for a job, it's expensive. It's expensive in terms you've got to have transportation, you've got to look presentable, and so it's economically expensive to look for a job, and it's also emotionally expensive because you go from one lack of success to another, or you find there's not really any jobs to go interview for. You can't even get interviews. And so looking for a job becomes such an emotional drain and an expense drain, particularly if you've been unemployed a long time, you haven't got any money to draw on to absorb the expenses of job hunting. So people give up, but they're not counted as unemployed. So if you compare the unemployment rate that they announce with the labor force participation rate, that is the percentage of the workforce is actually working, you see that the labor force participation rate is collapsing. It's fallen. And I don't believe there has ever in our history been a recovery in which the labor force participation rate fell. Normally, if there's a recovery, that means there are job opportunities and it draws people into the workforce. Instead, they've been leaving. So we know that the 4.7 unemployment rate is fake news. That's called the U3 rate officially. They have another official rate, which is U6. Now, U6 includes discouraged workers less than 1 year. So if you've been discouraged, for 1 day short of 1 year, you are included in this rate. And it's double the 4.7 rate. Now, there used to be a rate that included the long-term discouraged. The government ceased calculating that. It's too embarrassing. John Williams of shadowstats.com, he still estimates the long-term discouraged and includes those in the measure of the unemployment rate. And according to John, the current unemployment rate in the United States is 23%. So you see what they're telling us. It's about a 4.7 rate that they're telling us. That's about 1/4 the actual rate of unemployment. So if there's fake news about Syria and Russia and Iran and Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi, there's also fake news about the economic situation. They also, the Bureau of Labor Statistics also, which does the first Friday of every month, announces the previous month's payroll employment. Well, it turns out that most of the jobs that they claim that are created, they're not only lowly paid domestic services part-time, but they also come from what's called the birth-death model. The birth-death model was created by BLS back in the Reagan period when they greatly underestimated the Reagan recovery and were reporting no job gain when there was tremendous job gain. So they came up with a model that's supposed to estimate the unreported lost jobs from business closures and the unreported new jobs from business startup. And the difference between the two is added to the monthly job. Well, it turns out that this model was based on a rising economy, not falling one. And so it looks like about 100,000 of the monthly job report announcement are simply add-ons from this model. The jobs aren't really there. They're just produced by this estimate. So we don't really even know what the monthly payroll jobs are because of this model, which has this built-in bias factor. So then, what do we know about the economy? We know that there's no real growth in median real family income. There's no significant growth in retail sales. We see a shrinkage of the middle class. We see a rise in debt burdens. We get reports from the Federal Reserve that 1/2 of American 25-year-olds live at home with their parents because they can't get a job that supports an independent existence. We see other Federal Reserve reports that there are more people aged 24 to 34 living at home with parents than are living independently. So quite clearly, there's no strong consumer market. We get a lot of reports of large retailers closing stores, going out of business, of shopping centers suffering. This is usually blamed on internet shopping, and it's blamed on the shopping centers being old, and we're serving what was once a young neighborhood, and it's grown old, and no doubt there's some of that, but it looks overall like there's not any real consumer spending power. And so then that brings you to the stock market. We have, what seems to be historic high PE ratios, and yet there's no strong retail sales. There's no growth in real consumer median income. So what is the basis of that? So the whole thing looks like false news. Everything looks like a house of cards.
Do you think with Trump's policies, if he has any economic policies, can he turn all of this around? Is it possible?
You have to ask yourself, who has the power in the country? Is it elected officials, or is it the people who finance the elections, in which case the elected officials don't like to go against them? Who has benefited from the loss of American manufacturing jobs and American middle-class professional service jobs like software engineering, information technology? These things have been moved abroad on a wholesale basis, just huge numbers. So who benefits? Well, the corporations because and their shareholders, because it drops their labor costs and the difference goes straight to the bottom line, to profits. So the earnings of companies have come from lowering the labor costs by moving the jobs offshore. The earnings have not come from some booming consumer economy and rising American productivity that results in rising real wages. So if you're getting your profits by killing the domestic consumer, it's the domestic consumer's purchasing power that is lost when you move manufacturing and professional skill jobs overseas. So how is this a good economy? It's not. You get these short-term profits, but they come at the expense of destroying the domestic consumer market. So what can Trump do? Can he get some kind of law in place that stops the offshoring of jobs and requires them to come back? Well, probably not. It's probably now in violation of the World Trade Agreement, the World Trade Organization. They've got all kinds of rules, and probably it would be if he puts in tariffs, then he'd be in violation, I'm almost certain, of the WTO. How could he put in tariffs? He would have to get them passed, and the corporations are going to tell the House and Senate, no, we don't want that. Are they going to do what Trump wants or what the people who finance them want? So I'm not sure. Conceptually, something could be done if it could be legislated. That would be, I think, consistent with the WTO and all the other agreements in which we have been enmeshed. We're like caught in this net of all these agreements that take away your sovereignty and your ability to act as an independent country in the interest of your country. It's very difficult to do when you get in all these trade agreements. But conceptually, if it could be passed, you could cancel out the advantage of offshoring the jobs by changing the way you tax corporations. You would tax them on the basis of the geographical location of where they added value to their product. So if they add value to their product domestically, that is within the United States, they would have a low tax rate. But if they add value to their product overseas, in China or India or Indonesia or somewhere, and bring these things back into America to sell, they would have a high tax rate. And so by altering the way you tax them, you could eliminate the advantage they get from the lower labor costs and other costs, environmental, regulatory costs, from going abroad and searching for cheap labor. But of course, again, you'd have to be able to get that passed. And do the corporations want to have higher labor costs and therefore less profits? Only if they have a long-term time horizon and realize that what they have done and are doing by moving jobs offshore is destroy the American consumer market. So if they ever came to that realization, they might say, well, this really isn't in the long run interest of the shareholders. We've helped people make money in the short run. It's kind of like flipping real estate in a rising market. But there's no growth in family incomes. There's no growth in retail sales. So by moving consumer demand to other countries, because we let American workers, we lay them off and we go hire the Chinese and the Indians, we're killing the domestic American market. So possibly you could get that realization if there were enough people making the point. It would probably take years, because it takes years for the simplest kind of thing to spread into a general understanding. And then whoever is president might be able to get Congress to agree to this change, and the corporations might not oppose it. But other than that, I don't think much can be done. The United States is actually becoming a third world country. If you look at the employment of its labor, it's consistently in lowly paid domestic service jobs. Waitresses, bartenders, retail clerks, hospital orderlies. This is essentially India 50 years ago. And if you look at the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics projections, where jobs will grow most in the next 10 years, there's only two places that require any kind of college education. One is school teachers, and the other is registered nurses, which have to have a 2-year community college degree. That's it. So education is not the answer. They've been saying education is the answer, education is the answer. There are all kinds of educated people who can't get jobs that they were trained for. So, no, I don't think the economy can be restored. What's happening now is that older people, older Americans, retired, who had good company pension plans, who also saved and invested at a time when the markets were rational. And they also have Social Security, and they are now supporting their children and their grandchildren. But they've not had any interest income on their savings since when? 2008, because of the zero interest rate policy. So they've had to draw down their savings. And so as these savings are exhausted, and of course they won't be there to leave to heirs, so the system is being emptied of the savings of the past in order to support current existence. So I think on the whole, the United States as an economic system is washed up, and that there's nothing that can be done about it, just given the nature of how politics are structured and how decisions are made.
Now, you mentioned that there were individuals that were not elected and there were individuals that were elected, and many of these non-elected individuals might be controlling the country. Even the elected individuals, they report maybe to corporations who feed them funds. When you look at our country today, who's actually in control of the country? I mean, is it the Trump administration? You mentioned past interviews about neocons. We have the central bank. Some people call another group a deep state. Who do you see being in control of the United States right now?
Well, the military security complex is probably the most powerful. President Eisenhower warned us about the danger to democracy from the military security complex in 1961. So that was more than a half century ago. And of course, now it's even more entrenched. If you look at its annual budget, the annual budget of the military security complex is about $1,100,000,000,000. That's an annual budget. That's tremendous profit and power in that budget. And they're not going to turn loose of it. And that's why you see Trump completely unable to lessen the tensions that the Clinton, George W. Bush, and Obama regimes created with Russia. These tensions now go far beyond anything that ever existed during the Cold War. 2 or 3 weeks ago, the high command of the Russian military announced publicly that they had now been convinced by Washington that Washington was planning a surprise nuclear attack on Russia. Nothing like this ever happened in the Cold War. So we're on the edge of just some kind of miscalculation, and the world goes up in thermonuclear flame. So that is a very powerful interest. See, they were able to evict Trump's national security advisor on the grounds that he was too friendly to the Russians. Trump is under full-scale assault in the media by a special prosecutor, a former head of the FBI who is in with the military security complex. And even though there's no charge of a crime, because there's no evidence, they're investigating for obstruction of justice. So how do you obstruct justice when it's not a crime? So clearly they intend either to drive Trump from office or to impeach him or to create in the public's mind that he's some kind of a Russian agent and use this to block him from lessening the tensions. And it appears there's nothing Trump can do about that. He's done nothing. Another powerful group is the Israel lobby. And the Israel lobby is so powerful that nobody in the House or the Senate will dare stand against them. If they want something, they get it. It's unanimous. And what does the Israel lobby want? It wants to use the United States to overthrow Syria and Iran, as it used us to overthrow Iraq. Why? Because Israel wants the water resources in southern Lebanon. There's a big river there. Israel twice has sent the Israeli army in to occupy southern Lebanon, and twice they were driven out by Hezbollah, a militia, which has twice defeated the vaunted Israeli army and sent them screaming or running in fear for their lives. Well, this is a humiliation to Israel, but it also is a great frustration because they want that water. Well, who supports Hezbollah? Syria and Iran and Iraq. That's where they get the arms, money to support. So this is the reason we wanted to overthrow Syria. We'd gotten rid of Iraq, now we get rid of Syria, and this is why they keep going on about Iran. We never hear the end of that, despite the agreements. So the Israel lobby is extremely powerful. You can't go against them. No elected official has ever survived taking a stance against Israel. And then, of course, we have the big banks in Wall Street. The big banks essentially run the Fed. The operating arm of the Federal Reserve is the New York Federal Reserve Bank, who are the board of directors of the New York Fed. They're the executives of the banks, too big to fail. So the Fed was created in order to serve the banks. It's always served the banks, and that's what it's been doing since the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. The so-called quantitative easing, the Fed claimed and the financial media reported, was to stimulate the economy, low interest rates, to stimulate the economy. Of course, it never has. It hasn't. We've had the longest period stimulative monetary policy in our history, and there's no sign of it because the purpose of it was to raise the prices of the debt instruments on the big banks' books. Their balance sheets were in trouble. See, all debt moves together. So the lower the interest rate, the higher the price of a debt instrument. And so if you've got all these bogus mortgage derivatives and every other kind of derivative currency, who knows, on your books, and they've taken a hit and you're insolvent, the Fed can fix that simply by driving interest rates to zero so that the prices of the debt instruments rise. And lo and behold, you're solvent again. So that has been the whole purpose of the Fed's so-called easing. Now, why would they be changing? Well, maybe after, how many years has it been? It's been almost 10 years, right? 10 years they've been flooding the banks with money. Yeah, that's it. 07. It's 2017. 10 years. This policy's 10 years old. Well, maybe the banks there are back on their feet. And so now the Fed has a different worry. The dollar. The dollar is the basis of the power that the United States has because it's the reserve currency. Most international trade transactions are conducted in dollars. And this means then that we can pay our bills by printing money because it's the reserve currency of the world. So what is 10 years of creating enormous amounts of dollars, but not goods and services to absorb them? What's been the result? Well, the result's been to drive up the prices of financial assets, stocks and bonds, and real estate. So how is the Fed protected the dollar during this whole period? Well, they got the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank to do the same thing. They all print too. They all have quantitative easing too. So if all the reserve currencies are printing, the exchange rates stay relatively equal, to stay relatively the same. The dollar's not dropping relative to the others because they're all printing too. They even forced the Swiss to do this. Well then, what about the gold price? Because you may remember a few years ago, the gold price hit $1,900 an ounce. And then what started happening? Well, then what started happening was the bullion banks, the agents of the Federal Reserve, began dumping naked shorts in the futures market for gold. Unlike the stock market, if you short the stock market, you've got to borrow the stock. You've got to cover the short, but not in the gold futures market because the contracts are settled in cash. And so the bullion banks can create an enormous supply of paper gold. They just sit there and print up futures contracts. And then at some opportune time when the trading is practically zilch, they can dump huge amounts of these shorts in the market. It drives down price. Well, the price of gold is determined in the paper gold market. The futures market is not determined in the physical market where people actually buy and sell the bullion itself. It's determined in this futures market where they trade paper contracts. And there's no real limit on how many paper contracts you can print and dump. So they use that to drive the gold price down. And now you can watch it. Every time it starts rising, gets up close to 1,300, boop, there they come again. Massive amounts of shorts. And the price goes down. And of course, the bullion banks, they can always cover these shorts easy, because when they dump the shorts in, then the hedge funds who have gold holdings for, to keep their formulas balanced, the stop loss orders come into effect. And that selling adds, and the price goes further, and then margin calls, it goes further. And then the banks who caused all this can buy them up below, where they entered and make a killing on the whole deal. So that's how that works. That's how they control the gold price. So now then we see Bitcoin getting bid up. Well, what's the explanation of that? Well, I don't know, but one possible explanation is that people have realized it's the only thing that the Fed can't control. There can't be any more Bitcoins. I think there is a futures market, but it has to be covered. You can't print naked Bitcoin contracts like you can gold. So maybe that's the explanation. People who are trying to find some protection against the vast increase in fiat currencies that have happened in the last 10 years say, okay, then Bitcoin's the answer, because there's only so many. They can't make any more, and the Fed can't control it. So that's my general overview of the situation. Of course, there are other important private interests, the pharmaceuticals, the agribusiness. Monsanto is an extremely powerful player. But I think the three biggies is what I said: military security complex, the Israel lobby, and Wall Street and the big banks.
The generals that Trump has taken on, Mattis, he's taken on others within his administration, and they keep talking about how they're going to do things differently than Obama out in Afghanistan, out in Syria, where they were explaining how the Obama administration, they weren't really hitting the Islamic State targets, they weren't really hitting the terrorists, and now they're going to go out and actually hit these targets. Do you see them actually going after the terrorist groups now? Or is this just another play on words and trying to convince us that this is what they're really doing?
The reason there is an ISIS in Syria is that Obama and Hillary sent it there. ISIS is what the Obama regime used to overthrow Gaddafi. And you may well remember, Obama was poised to invade Syria. We had this fake news about Assad's use of chemical weapons against his own people.
Right.
And he had finally crossed the red line, or whatever the line was called. And Obama was preparing an invasion of Syria, just like they had invaded Iraq. Of course, it had nothing to do with Assad or chemical weapons. It had to do with getting rid of a supporter of Hezbollah who blocks Israel's theft of southern Lebanon. Well, two things happened. The British Parliament voted no. And so all of a sudden, we didn't have any cover. And the other thing that happened was the Russians said, no, we'll fix it diplomatically. We're going to take any chemical weapons that are in Syria and turn them over to you, and you can destroy them. So this blocked Obama from invading. And so Hillary and the neocons and the CIA, they said, okay, we'll just send ISIS to do the job. So that's that story. We have always supported ISIS, an American weapon, ISIS. And so what is happening now that the Russians and Syrians have won the war, we are pretending to be fighting ISIS so we can get troops in Syria. We were trying to petition the country so that we could keep the fake rebellion going and keep this pressure on Assad and Syria indefinitely. Maybe tire out the Russians or whatever. But that's what the plan is. And so far, we don't really see any evidence of us attacking ISIS. We see evidence of the United States attacking Syrian troops. The other day, they shot down a Syrian airplane that was attacking ISIS. And so what is happening is, whereas Obama had sort of said, well, we're not going to be able to get Syria knocked off for Israel. The Trump group is saying, oh, we're going to somehow have to rescue the situation by pretending that we're fighting ISIS. But what they're really trying to do is to get troops and equipment, stuff there that they can use to petition the country and keep part of it under our control so we can continue to foment so-called rebels. And that's what that situation is. Now, the Russians, in my view, miscalculated. They've had the war run several times, and then they stop. And they do this because they have this crazy hope that eventually the Americans are going to cooperate with Russia in the fight against terror. But of course, we're not going to do any such thing. So every time they stop, we rush in more. We get more involved. And the last time, when they hesitated, hoping to get some kind of an agreement with us to fight terror together, because they're trying to find some way to reduce these tensions that we have escalated, we stuck troops in. And then the other day, when we shot down that Syrian plane, this seemed to have crossed a Russian line. And they announced, as best as I can understand it, a no-fly policy. And they said, if you come into the territory in which the Russian and Syrian army are operating, you're going to be targeted. So no one knows whether this means they're just going to lock on and make pilots worry, or whether this means they're going to blow the American planes out of the sky. I suspect the latter, because they said whether it was an aircraft or unmanned drones. So there wouldn't be any point of just locking on an unmanned drone. It wouldn't worry a pilot doesn't have one. So I think here the Russians have finally realized that they were kind of stupid to think that they were going to get any kind of cooperation from Washington in fighting ISIS, and that they would not be able to use this type of cooperation to smooth over all the tensions that have been raised by the neoconservatives and Obama and George W. Bush and Clinton. It's been going on for years, decades, actually. And so now I think when they make this type of announcement, I think they mean it. I don't think the Russians bluff. If they say something, they're very slow to do anything that's provocative. But if they draw a line, then it's real. That's my view. So now we have to see, what will the idiots in Washington do? I mean, they're all idiots. That's all they are. They're idiots. They're low-grade idiots. That's who our government is. If they say, oh, well, we don't care about the Russians, then poof, out of the sky goes some American pilot. Then what happens next?
Well, it looks like they're getting ready to do something, because from an anonymous source, of course, coming out of the Associated Press, someplace in the White House, they're saying that Syria and Russia are preparing another chemical attack, and they see signs of this, which is really absolutely ridiculous. I mean, why would they do this at this point? We know that the other chemical attacks were completely fake, but to me, it looks like they're getting ready to do something else in Syria with this type of warning.
Well, it's not clear exactly what they can do other than start a war with Russia, because the Russians clearly have air superiority, not just because their fighters are far superior to ours, but because they have all these ground-air-based systems, this SS-300, SS-400. They don't fail. So what really, I think, there can be another false flag attack. I'm sure Washington will arrange that, and they prepare the public for it by telling them in advance the Russians are going to do it. I mean, how would they know that? They wouldn't know that. Furthermore, anyone with a grain of sense knows that these chemical weapons are not very effective, and there's no point in bothering with them. And that's why they're very seldom used. They're just not very effective. And so clearly the Russians and Syrians are not going to do any such thing. This is just part of the demonization. So it deepens the hostility of the Western population who still believe the media against Russia. And that makes it easier for the United States to implement some risky or unjustified policy. So that's what that's about. They say the Russians and Syrians are going to use chemical weapons. It's to cause a kind of hysteria and hatred for the Russians that's now associated with chemical weapons. And therefore, all the populations in Europe and England and Canada, Australia, the United States, they say, oh, these mean, dirty Russians. And so they accept whatever kind of policy Washington comes up with, no matter how irresponsible or provocative or dangerous. But what policy can they do? I don't know at this point. The military in the United States still has some intelligent generals, and I think they realize that helping Israel isn't worth nuclear war. And I think that they understand that Russia can't be pushed around when they have vital interest involved. See, the other reason we have for attacking Syria is if we can overthrow Assad, then we can unleash these so-called jihadist forces on Iran. And if we can then do the same thing to Iran, we started in Iraq and Libya, we knocked those two countries off, and it looks like we're going to be defeated in Syria. But the reason for, other than clearing the path for the Israelis in Lebanon, the other reason is to spread jihadism into destabilizing Iran, because then that exposes Russia. Russia has a large Muslim population, and then they can spread that into the Russian Federation, and that way weaken the country that can block American unilateral action. That's the neoconservative strategy, that while we were locked away for years in wars in the Middle East, that the neocons said we're going to be 3-week cakewalks. Now it's 16 years of cakewalk. The Russians brought themselves back up, and now they can tell us no. Well, the neocons can't stand that anybody can block American unilateralism. That's inconsistent with their ideology of America being the hegemonic power of the world. So then getting rid of Syria is a way of spreading it into Iran, and then from there into Russia, and causing so much turmoil within the Russian Federation itself that the Russians simply can't function as a check on American imperialism. So the Russians aren't, I think, not going to let Syria go no matter what we do. Plus, it's been a big success for them. It's been a reassertion of their power and influence. It's made an impact all over the world. It's made the Russians feel like they're back again now, that even though the Soviet Union collapsed and they went from being somebody to being nobody, that now again they're somebody. And so that's not something the Russian government is going to turn loose of. And if the people in Washington are too stupid to know that, then it's going to be a nuclear war.
Thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. I really appreciate it. Once again, how can people see your work?
Just go to my website. It's just www.paulcraigroberts.org.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for being on the Spotlight. I really appreciate it.
You're certainly welcome. All the best.
You too. Thank you.